Good evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be here at the RSA again, and more especially a pleasure for me to be with John Gray, who I am unashamed in regarding as one of the most significant thinkers alive today in this country. I first became aware of John's work comparatively late in the day when he published his book Straw Dogs, which was sent to me. I knew nothing of him. I read it, I was gripped, I reviewed it. I got in touch with John and profiled him for the Independent newspaper and found that an intensely invigorating exercise. As I say, I'm unashamed about the influence he's had on my own thinking, and when a review of one of my novels came out recently, a few years ago, and said, this showcases self-obsession with John Gray's thinking, I thought, fine, I don't mind, bring it on. I think Straw Dogs, which doubtless many of you have read, had a big impact at a very kind of key moment, actually, really when the liberal left in this country had fallen incredibly uncomfortably on the vaulting horse of the Iraq War, so that it split the left in two, right up the crotch. I thought that his thinking was very germane. I then went back and read John's book on globalization, False Dawn, and then, of course, after Straw Dogs came John's book, Al-Qaeda and What It Means to Be Modern, which I took really, just to paraphrase it very, very simply, to be a corrective to the view that was emerging at that point that the soi-disant war on terror was being waged between two cultures that were in some sense from different temporal periods and were in some way antithetical to each other because of this kind of chronoclasm or anachronism about the Islamic, political Islam. And he then developed some of his arguments further in a book that was not only, I think, philosophically and intellectually challenging, but also curiously, a kind of thumping good read, his book Black Mass, which really linked Blair's project, Blair and Bush's project in the Middle East to one of John's great bugbears, which was certain kinds of thinking that came out of the Enlightenment, and I'm going to ask him about that this evening. And now, then came a collection, a kind of career best, Gray's Anatomy, I think the year before last, reflecting the kind of breadth of John's thinking over the years. And now we have the Immortalization Commission. I wanted to sort of start off, John, by saying I saw a mutual friend of ours, Martin Amis, at the weekend, and he was saying that the last time he saw you were on a train together, and Martin had been very much affected by Straw Dogs, but he held on fervently to one thing that he felt was an enormous counterfactual to the argument you present in Straw Dogs, which is very, very simply, but we can develop this more, to as it were, place humanity back in the common fold with the rest of the animals. I mean, I think the book is actually subtitled Humans and Other Animals or something of that form. And Martin was saying, I said to John, but, what about the fact that humans are the only animal that we know of who knows when they will die? And doesn't this existential fact about human experience in and of itself completely change humanity and make humanity a case apart? And he said that you said to him, I have an answer to that. I'm developing an answer to that argument. And I wondered to what extent you see this book, The Immortalization Commission, as your riposte to that kind of argument.
Thank you very much, Will, for that generous introduction. And the answer to the question is yes, the book is a reaction or a response to that obvious but actually rather profound question. Humans do differ from other animals in that they reflect on their place in the world in a way that, as far as we know, other animals don't or even can't. And one of the things which does set us apart and is shown in funeral rites and the whole set of ceremonies and rituals that surround death in pretty well all human cultures is that we know more than that something odd happens to other members of our species, which perhaps other animals do. Elephants gathering around dead elephants or whatever. They seem to know that seem to sense that there's some kind of inexplicable event that happens to their kin. We know that that event will happen to each of us. So one could put it in where the only animal whose lives are pervaded by a sense of their own mortality. And I think that kind of shock, which must have arisen when the sense of self, perhaps it's coeval with the sense of having the kind of self that humans do. So potentially we could even date when it emerged in the history and prehistory of humankind, is distinctively human. And one of the things I argue in the book is that the very fact that after the partial and perhaps temporary, but nonetheless real, decline of religious faith, particularly the type of monotheism, Christian monotheism, that promised immortality to humans, that after that decline and along with the decline in the 19th century, new projects emerged in England and later on in Russia, whereby the growth of human knowledge, science, would be used to present the possibility, the practical possibility, not just a theoretical one, that humans could somehow cheat or circumvent death, demonstrates to me that humans remain what I call a death-defined animal, the only one we know about. We define ourselves in terms of death because only we are faced with the challenge and the problem of death. Now, in the book, I'll just say briefly one. I approached this by telling two stories, or two sets of stories, one about Victorian and Edwardian England, and one about early Bolshevik Russia. And in the case of Victorian and Edwardian England, the more I studied it, the more I became convinced that what was so challenging in Darwinism wasn't that it presented an alternative account of the emergence of the human species or creation, although that was important. In other words, it's not that it presented a different account to the myth of Genesis, because the myth of Genesis has always been regarded throughout nearly all of the history of religion, both by Jewish and Christian scholars, as a myth, actually. Never been seen as a theory until later on. So it wasn't that. It was that if Darwin was right, then humans were like other animals in that each of them would die and die forever, and the species itself would become extinct as other species had become, if that was true. And that was a tremendous psychological shock to the Victorians for a number of reasons which might not be immediately obvious, but one was that in Victorian life was still full in a way that we, at least in England, don't have, of random death. Lots of women lost children in infancy. And contrary to what we think, they don't seem to have been hardened by the experience. They were absolutely devastated by it and remained devastated by it. Lots of people lost fiancés or lovers or wives or husbands later on in life. One of the characters in the book, a woman whom it was believed Arthur Balfour had loved, and who the Prime Minister and writer on theology had loved, and who late in his life he got involved in a posthumous correspondence, so it seemed, through automatic writing with this woman who'd been waiting in the hereafter for him to come over and rejoin him. Two of her actual suitors had died, and if we believe, which some people do, I'm not so sure, that Balfour might have wanted to marry her, then she would have had three suitors before she finally got married. Random death was kind of commonplace, but still very hard to cope with because it involved the finality of loss.
You made that very interesting point, and you've sort of glided past it, but it certainly struck hard with me that the impact of that this idea of the literal truth of Genesis and of the Bible story is a comparatively modern invention, and I think you state that very clearly. And I take your point about the real impact of Darwinism, but of course Henry Sidgwick, who is the pivotal figure, the moral philosopher who's the pivotal figure in your exploration of the Society of Psychical Research and this kind of Edwardian group who were dedicated in some way to cheating death, or at least investigating the possibility of communication from the afterworld. I thought he was uncompromising in his understanding that without deism, you can have, without theism, you can have no deontology, you can have no objective morality grounded somehow in the structure of the universe.
Yes.
And I take it that you would agree with that.
I do, yeah.
And it seems to me that the first part of the book is a corrective to certain refusals to take that on board.
Yes.
Really in the English-speaking world.
Yes.
But it's quite a calibrated thing on your part. It's to say, well, you really have to take this on board now, that you can't think this way after this point. Or
After theism.
After theism.
Yeah. It's perfectly true, and it's very important because you have to remember who Sidgwick was. I mean, he was, maybe along with John Stuart Mill, the premier public intellectual of the Victorian period. He wrote a profound book of moral theory, which is still studied throughout the English-speaking world.
I had to study it.
Yeah. The trouble with it, by the way, or one of the troubles with it, it's a profound book and still got very arresting parts in it, is that he took out the conclusion in the first edition. Because in the first edition, what he said was, I sort of got getting to the end, he said, I've considered all these different types of moral theories and moral systems, and I've come up with a range of principles which they contain, and they all seem to me to be extremely reasonable, even self-evident principles. The trouble is they conflict with each other. How do I get out of this, he says. He says, well, I can't. And he said, unless we assume essentially theism, or what he sometimes calls the postulate of immortality of a certain kind, then he says, instead of, and this is all kind of capital lettered in a Victorian way, instead of order, we have an anarchy, capital A, a confusion, a chaos in ethics. Now, I guess there's a widespread idea that ethics can remain roughly what it is if you get rid of theism. Well, the core of Sidgwick's ethics, his practical ethics, by the way, as well as his theoretical one, what he tried to live by, was duty, capital D. It was the idea that deontology, as Will has put it, the idea that we all have certain duties, that we have duties maybe to ourselves or to other human beings and so forth. And that was the core of his practical morality, and he tried to sort of situate that in various theories, utilitarianism, theories of moral common sense, and he didn't sort of come up with anything that satisfied him. Hence his many decades of pursuing scientific evidence that human personality survived bodily death, because he was convinced that if it was the end, if death was really the end, then insofar as following one's duty involved sacrifice of self, sacrifice of one's desires or inclinations, then it would end in nothing, and that would be that. He himself, by the way, was a type of person who said, well, I will go on. Even towards the end of his life, he told friends, I found nothing. I found no evidence. I've spent all my years of studying this, decades. He's a very honest man in nearly all respects. Found absolutely nothing. But one must simply go on and live the ethical life as he conceived it. But he was afraid that once the consciousness of the finality of death, if that came about, sunk into everyday consciousness of many people, that would kind of crumble away, and people would start to ask the question, well, why then should I be moral? Why then should I pursue these moral duties? And this is sort of the one thing he has in common with someone he's utterly different from in any other respect, which is Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought, I think he exaggerated, but Nietzsche thought that once theism was out of the way, that morality would have to change. Nietzsche welcomed that. Sidgwick did not. Sidgwick was afraid of it. Sidgwick feared that a kind of moral anarchy would come. I think in essence, though, I mean, his essential idea, there may be other, in the book I explore other conceptions of what ethics might be, like the ancient Greek conception, which didn't rely on monotheism. So there are other alternatives. But the idea that something like Christian morality or a sort of liberalized and diluted version of it can survive the complete disappearance of theism, he thought was an error. He thought was a mistake.
Mm. And I suppose, I mean, this is in a way what you do in the first half of the Immortalization Commission in terms of Sidgwick and in terms of the Society of Psychical Research. It's stretched around what you've written in the past. Absolutely.
Yeah, all right. Just in case.
That's better.
That's better. Is it better?
In a way, you've
okay, thank you.
The first part of your book, John, sort of stretches round an area that you've investigated and written about before, which is really what you view as the false substitutions involved in humanism. You know, that humanism comes to stand proxy as a kind of dummy form of theism, in essence, for the purposes of morality. Let's shift the scene, though, in order to get the full schema of the book, over to the section that is concerned with another radical form, if you like, of the humanist post-Enlightenment project, which is Soviet Bolshevism. And in a strange way, I mean, the Immortalization Commission is your most novelistic work, in a way. It's about stories, and it's about characters. And in a way, I suppose the character that connects them, though not directly, is Wells.
H.G. Wells, yes.
Who is, in a way, a quintessential, not quintessential, but a defining Edwardian thinker here, and had this long affair, both a kind of sexual affair and a kind of intellectual affair with Bolshevism.
Yes.
And he, through his mistress, through his lover, it has a taproot, really, into this strange project, the Immortalization Commission of the title. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, because I think people won't be familiar with these ideas.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, the person who connects Edwardian England, this kind of the use of science to show that humans do not, in fact, die. I mean, that's the essence of the project that the psychical researchers, who included people in the Royal Society, very distinguished scientists of the day, was to show that humans don't die. Many of them, in fact, said that Darwinism continues in the afterlife, which I've always found a bit puzzling, since in the afterlife, as far as we ever heard about, there's no reproduction, and without reproduction, hard to see that Darwinism would work. But anyway, no DNA, no, But anyway, they've often said that because by evolution, they didn't mean natural selection. What they meant was progress. So progress could fail on this side, our side, but on the other side, it would be going on in this ghostly side. Now, the link is with Wells. Wells goes to Russia on a number of occasions. He's very impressed by Lenin. Lenin doesn't reciprocate it. Says, who is that ghastly little bourgeois? But Wells is very... Now, what's the root? What's the sort of intellectual root of this? Well, I think, again, Wells heard T.H. Huxley lecture in London on Darwinism, Darwin's great public defender and disciple, and imbibed the Huxleyan message. And the Huxleyan message was, Darwinism shows that the universe and human evolution are amoral and purposeless. We come about in the world by chance. Everything is governed by impersonal laws and by randomness, and evolution is a mixture of randomness and necessity. No room there. But humans being there, they're self-conscious of themselves, possibly partly because of their consciousness of death. Humans can inject in the world, can inject meaning and purpose, and the human species can become what no other species has become before, self-conscious, and can control and improve its position in the world. That's, I think, what a lot of people here tonight still believe. Now, Wells did believe that, and he believed it in a form that he thought was realistic. He thought that a part of the species, he didn't have much time for the human mass, as he called it, a part of the species, an intelligent part, for most of his life included himself until he realized he didn't fully qualify. An intelligent part of the species, which was apprised of modern science, which had a scientific attitude to life, could, as it were, take over in the world and shape it according to a coherent design, a coherent plan, so that humans themselves would become better, not just morally better or in better social conditions, but a better species. And some of his non-fiction, by the way, is rather horrifying in that respect. If you go back and read Anticipations, which was one of his first books of prophecy, entirely non-fiction, you find him saying many of the things that he later put into the mouth of Dr. Moreau in his famous, he says things like, well, you've got all these inefficient peoples. What are you going to do with them? He said, well, the world's not a charity. Doesn't sound promising. You've got masses of, he said, boring, tedious, sort of ordinary people. What are they going to do? Well, they might be useful for a while. Somebody's got to collect the garbage and so on. But they're obviously for the high jump later on. And so it's, but without caricaturing it, his view was, and this is why he liked Lenin, and he says in a passage I quote, he says, Lenin does kill people, kills lots of people. But he does it with scientific precision and has a scientific attitude. He's the best type of scientific person. So Wells goes over there, exactly as you say, to see a kind of project, which is not just the project of reconstituting Russia after the First World War and the Civil War. It's a project of building a scientific society. And a scientific society would be one in which humans, or at least a human elite of some kind, would inject order and meaning and purpose in a process which Darwin and Huxley and Wells believed had up till that point had been completely purposeless. And the title of the book, The Immortalization Commission, comes from the episode following Lenin's death, in which the commission which was set up to decide what to do with him and how to conduct the funeral, which was called the Funeral Commission, the name was changed in the course of these deliberations to the Immortalization Commission, when a number of those people associated with it began to have the idea that he should be kept in a form in which could always be an inspiration. And a couple of them, including Lunacharsky, by the way, who was a former disciple of Madame Blavatsky, the Theosophist, but was also the first commissar of enlightenment in the new Soviet regime.
I think what, if I could just break in there.
Go on.
I would take it, because what happens then is an astonishing, through figures like Lunacharsky, and especially through Gorky,
yeah.
is a kind of syncretism, isn't it, between Bolshevism, or Marxist-Leninism, to be more precise, and certain forms of mystical thought.
And of occultism.
And I take it that your view is that is inherent in the current of Marxian thought to some extent, that openness to that kind of syncretic development.
It's inherent, I would even say, in modern thought, because they weren't alone, the God builders, as they called themselves. This strand, it was only one strand, Lenin never belonged to it. He had contempt for it. He said all this God building is necrophilia. He wrote that to Gorky. Had no time for it at all. But a group of them did, and we find Lunacharsky saying, God is the future humanity. That's what God is. We're building God. God will exist and hasn't existed up till now. And we find some of them taking on some of these really far-fetched and weird ideas, which have a certain poetry in them, I think, like those of one Russian Orthodox mystic who believed that the human task, as he put it, was to physically resurrect through the use of science everyone who had ever died. Not just us, but everyone in the past. Now, that has a certain poetry, practical problems maybe, but poetry. But so, you see, I would put it like this, and I guess this would be one of the things that is hardest for people who don't share my interpretation to accept. I think the confusion of science with magic, not just with faith or religion, but with magic, with occultism, with the idea that humans can transcend or circumvent or cheat natural laws, is sort of encrypted in modern life for a number of reasons. I don't expect that even if everybody in the world read my book, God forbid, that they would change their views on this. It's deeply built into our way of thinking, that science can do what religion and magic promised. They can indefinitely postpone death, even if they can't make it rid us from us altogether. They can be used to create plenty where there was previously scarcity. They can do all kinds of things and eradicate immemorial evils. And that, to me, is, although in many ways science has, of course, improved our conditions, we do have to live longer than humans typically have in the past. And we all have the experience of going to the boots chemist and finding drugs that work better or cheaper and computers that are smaller and cheaper and faster. And we all experience progress in certain aspects of our lives, which actually deepens this sort of illusion or confusion between science and magic. And all over Europe, Ernst Mach, the founder of many kind of modern movements, great scientist and promoter of positivism in philosophy, great rationalist, also supported and founded, actually, partly, the Monist League, which was, he said, the purpose of it was to develop not a new theory, but an evolutionary religion. Haeckel, before that, German thinker, also had ideas very similar. So it was all over Europe at the time, and I don't think it's gone away because, as Will know, but those of you who haven't read the book won't. In the last chapter, I discuss figures such as Ray Kurzweil in America, who proposes not freezing people or their brains and keeping them alive long enough for science to develop that they can be resurrected. By the way, when I met some of these people in the 80s, I said, have you thought about it? I said, how long do you think this will take? They said, oh, not longer than 200 or 300 years. Technology will be up to snuff by then. Well, have you thought about what happened in the last 200 or 300 years? 2 world wars, Civil War in the United States, gigantic economic depression, Pearl Harbor. Won't this all happen? Another European pessimist, no good listening to him. But in other words, they think that present institutions will continue forever. But Kurzweil's gone beyond that. He doesn't want to have these frozen cadavers lying about in American deserts for centuries. What he proposes instead is, and he's produced a book of diet, if you want, it's available in Britain, to enable you to live long enough to be able to do this, people in the present generation. If you pursue the right, you can live long enough so that you get to a point at which your mind or your consciousness or some sliver of your conscious self can be uploaded into cyberspace through a computer. And in cyberspace, you can have as many virtual bodies as you like. You can switch gender. You can have not just 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 love affairs, but thousands and thousands. And if you get bored with the body you have them in, you can have a few more bodies, etc. In other words, what you'll have is immortality. And that book is quite influential. It's cited by some historians, including one recent historian who wrote a book called Why the West Has Ruled Up Till Now. Though batty, in my view, it's quite an influential idea.
But in many ways, lesser forms. I mean, I think this is something that I find particularly engaging about this book and your other books, is that you have a kind of method of advancing your ideas, which is, to put bluntly, these crazy people seem to believe these crazy things, but as one reads it, one begins to realize chillingly that these are only extreme forms of ideas that are absolutely in common parlance and in the atmosphere and actually given credence. And I think on that point about, I mean, you can't pick up a newspaper without finding an article about our ever-increasing lifespan, about the possibilities for our kind of interpenetration with some form of cybernautic existence, and so on and so forth. It's very much a part of the kind of workaday, quotidian ideology of our time.
It is.
There is some kind of low-level form of immortality accessible to all of us at the moment.
Yes, or at least of indefinite life.
Yes.
At least of indefinite longevity. And I think you're absolutely right, because one response, which of course I was aware of, I think as you rightly say, Will, I mean, before I ever wrote the book or my other books, is to say, well, these people, of course, were all mad. I said, well, Sidgwick? You know, he wasn't that mad. I mean, these were kind of very gifted and accomplished thinkers of their day. We said, well, we don't believe any of this nonsense. We are much more moderate. We're much more modest. We just think that we can use knowledge to improve human life in certain respects. That's all we think. Well, my view is that there are implausibilities in this quotidian ideology that is now forms practically everyone's worldview. I mean, I guess one key thing is that let's think of Kurzweil. Supposing we could, in fact, get to the point where we could upload some part of ourselves. It wouldn't be you or me. It wouldn't be myself with all of its unconscious dreams and fears and dreads and whatnot. It'd be some sliver that's somehow selected. We could upload that. And supposing we could do that. And supposing in this afterlife, this cyber afterlife, we're messing around with hundreds of different bodies and genders and so forth. Would we be invulnerable up there in this? Well, two problems. One is the cyber world depends, as far as we know up till now, upon certain things in our corrodable, rustable material world. There have to be computers, there have to be physical. What happens if somebody, as almost happened to me recently in an interview, said, "Oh, I don't know how to record this," and press the button. Gone, as it were. Supposing, could you be eliminated from the cyber world once you'd achieved immortality in it? Paradoxical. But also, even events like WikiLeaks, is relevant. The cyber universe is now an area, the cyber world, an area of intense conflict. Disinformation, information, but also of war, of actual war. So even if we could, so to speak, get up there in this fantasy, we wouldn't be immune from the turbulence and the death even. We could be somehow switched off or erased, or our disk wiped clean. Up there in this other world. But if you take something much, much less extreme than that, you see, what I think people will say, well, we don't, of course, none of us takes Kurzweil's stuff seriously. He's read a lot of money, by the way, so some people do. I believe a lot of the Palo Alto kind of Ayn Rand reading, entrepreneurs think it's sort of all absolutely wonderful. But there are many kind of more moderate. Science can do certain things. It has enabled us to live longer and probably will enable us to live longer still, most of us, because there'll be huge inequalities in the world and there'll be huge human conflicts, including if the future is like the past, which is the basis of in ethics and politics, I think the future is likely to be in essential respects like the past. In terms of human knowledge and technology and human power, it'll be different, but in the future, I think there will be great wars. There will be great revolutions. There will be great inequalities. There'll be enormous wrenching conflicts. What science can do, it can enlarge human power. It can't make human beings more reasonable or change their natures because humans use it. Humans to develop it. So that's, in a sense, the quotidian ideology that most people have still, and I suspect most people in this room still have, is we, who's we, by the way? We, for Wells it was we aviators. He wasn't an aviator, of course. Time for it was we bankers, even more now. We intellectuals, we thinkers, we will use knowledge to improve the world. Well, there is no we. There are just millions and billions of human beings who use this knowledge for a variety of different purposes.
If I could pick up on one thing in what you said there, and you said a lot, it seems to me that there is a covert supposition lying beneath this quotidian ideology and the wilder fringes of the kind of immortalization commission we're all implicated in. And I think it's something you've critiqued in the past as well, which is the impulse simply to produce more, to kind of the objective of human social existence, of civilization, if you like, is to, ungrammatically bigger itself in some sense. And I know in your other work, you've that really is, if you like, the kind of the working side of the ideology. That's what it. Do you think it's there to justify that, or do you think it simply is a product of the tendency that we have to produce more? I mean, all economic arguments at the moment, for example, are predicated. It's not without accident that the word sustainable as a kind of pabulum. I mean, what does sustainable really mean?
Nothing.
It means nothing, of course.
Yeah, absolutely nothing.
And all arguments about how we should go forward, in some sense, are about more, aren't they? Now, do you see those two as very much interrelated? More and forever?
We've just, I think, stumbled on the possibility of an ideological underpinning for the big society. It'll be called the sustainable more. Or more sustainability, or even more and more sustainability.
I think more and more sustainability. It has more of a ring.
It has more of a ring, yes. And they'll say, there's nothing ideological about this, it's just common sense. I'm practical, because one of the things is people are very unwilling to admit that their quotidian views are in fact shaped by anything like I think the more, the production of more goods, more life experiences, more of everything, as it were, or at least of everything that we desire for a while, is deeply rooted again in modern life. I don't actually think, and it's deeply rooted in the economic system we all have, and I don't just mean Western capitalism, because non-Western capitalism, if that's what exists in China, seems to operate under a similar imperative. What would happen in China if economic growth slowed down or went into reverse? The rulers of China, and I think many other people, I would be one of them, would think there'd probably be some sort of explosion. So I don't think it's necessarily humanly primordial, that. I mean, if we look back into human prehistory, there have been lots and lots of human cultures that have reproduced themselves for generation after generation without actually changing their way of life or expanding it. Think of all the hunter-gatherers, or think of the way Tibet slipped into feudalism and Lamaism for several centuries, or the way in which Edo Japan cut itself off for several centuries. But even before that, there are actually most human cultures that have ever existed haven't been dedicated to more. So it's not, I don't think it's something that goes with human nature. But it is deeply encrypted in the way we live, and the way, I guess, all of us live. I mean, when we come late in our lives, I mean, how many of us will look back and honestly say, I wish I'd had less sex? Or I wish I'd had fewer holidays. If only I'd earned less money. If only not many of us will say that. And so it's deeply that we want more, and that in a sense is connected with the immortalization project, especially when it goes through the filter of humanistic thought, and people say, well, but only in a sustainable way. We want to have sustainably more. We want, yes, we'll have 9 billion people, which we never had before, but it'll be sustainable, because as long as we can get some baddies out of the way, wicked corporations, or once they're out of the way, all will be well. Well, I guess one of the points of the book is to say that too is magical thinking. It's magical thinking.
It's some of you. It's interesting looking on Amazon or a site like that. And I read, the other night I read some of the critiques that people send in about your books, and what seems to particularly enrage people, though, about your thought, is the idea that you seem to dismiss progress. And you have these people writing comments saying, I'm sitting in my lovely warm house on penicillin, which if I didn't have, I would have died of septicemia last week, and my 92-year-old uncle is next, and so on and so forth. And they feel this at a very visceral level.
Yes.
And they feel that you are in some way laying waste to all of the kind of material and human gains of the post-Enlightenment period, because I think you very much locate the point at which this all happened in the Enlightenment and around the period of the Enlightenment and the concomitant or latter Industrial Revolution. And what do you feel when you read that? Do you not feel like getting in touch with them and saying, I'm not going to take your penicillin away, or I'm not going to turn off your electricity?
What I feel is that they're rattled. I mean, if what I was saying was just something which was sort of completely absurd, or that they couldn't for a single moment believe, they wouldn't get so angry. So what is it? I mean, what is it in this response which you could say, well, it's just flatly contrary to their experience. But if it was sort of flatly contrary to their experience, if I said, well, it never rains, I mean, they wouldn't take that very seriously. There's something else in it, which is this, I guess, which is, on the one hand, of course, there are areas where I'm not a relativist, I'm not a postmodernist. Progress is real. What progress means is cumulative and all but irreversible advance. That's what I understand progress to mean. In other words, progress occurs when you have something is achieved which is worthwhile or important. It can be the growth of knowledge, and that it has a certain kind of built-in momentum. And I think science is progressive in that sense. And I think so is technology. So in science and technology, knowledge grows. I don't for a moment believe this once fashionable view that science is just a belief system like magic or I think we can know more and we do know more. Science isn't a fixed worldview, by the way, because one thing we do know for sure is that most of our theories contain errors. They always have and they always will. So it's not absolutely fixed, but we do know more. So there's progress in science and in technology. And of course there are also, I'm not an ethical relativist either. It's very, very bad news to be tortured, even if you're tortured by a member of your own tribe or culture. It's very, very bad news to be raped, even if you're raped by your husband or your whatever. There are certain things, there are certain human evils, which I view as culturally universal, or if you like, anthropologically universal. I don't think humans get used to pain and persecution and so on, the way some animals are supposed to get used to it. By the way, if you walk around a zoo, which I used to do at one time, you go to good zoos and bad zoos. If you go to the bad zoos, you see the animals don't look well. They don't adapt to their conditions and acquire a zoo culture. They stop breeding. Their fur looks dreadful. They develop neuroses. If you then go to a good zoo or a better zoo, and they don't look like that. So in that sense, well-being is objective in a certain kind of way. I'm not a relativist about that at all. I don't think that. So I don't think either of things, but I think what real advances in ethics and politics never acquire the momentum and never will acquire the momentum that real advances in science and technology have. Real advances in ethics and politics can be lost in the blink of an eye. And the example I give of this, because it's one which I think is very important, is the way in which, up till, let's say, 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, if you suggested that torture would be rehabilitated as a practice. I don't mean practice, because it went on being practiced all over the place. The British practiced it in Northern Ireland, the French in Algeria. It was routine in Soviet mental hospitals. It's routine in parts of the Chinese judicial system and so on. So it carried on. But there were certain powerful prohibitions of it, which to some extent restrained it. So if you said that 5 years later, 5 or 6 years later, the President of the United States, the world's preeminent liberal regime, the world's preeminent regime of rights, would defend a form of torture, waterboarding, you'd be considered a wild, misanthropic pessimist, if not a nihilist. And yet it happened. In other words, a fundamental element of what I regard as civilized life vanished in an instant. And I'm not convinced, actually. If there's been a change, it's because of Obama, but the change has not been probably as big as one might expect.
Obama currently very uneasy about changes in essentially a client regime to which torture was outsourced under his predecessor for reasons so.
So my point is not that. There are many kind of ethical advances which are absolutely real. In improvements in partial emancipation of women, changes in the position of gays, and one of my views is, that cultures or regimes that don't accept this, I don't speak of those countries, well, it's an interesting case of diversity. Taliban buries gays alive and so on. I said, it's just barbarism, pure and simple. But the point about it is that barbarism, pure and simple, can happen anywhere very quickly, and as I say, in the blink of an eye. So the difference between the cumulative advance that's possible in science and in technology and the advances that have occurred in ethics and politics is that the latter are extremely fungible and can just vanish overnight. They're lost very quickly and very easily.
I think there's so much I'd like to,
on that note of optimism,
to monopolize the conversation, but I'm not allowed to, which I don't like. It's your chance to come in and ask John Gray anything you would like to.